Hello, everyone. We're going to take optimistic, and talk about the U.S. in World War II. And we'll just go through the whole thing from the beginning of the war to the end of the war. And the U.S. is a great measuring stick to just kind of take the U.S. and follow the U.S. through the war from 41 all the way to 45. And it gives you pretty much both theaters of war. So we'll do this, and this will be online so we can take time in class to review for our AP exam coming up. But so the U.S. in World War II, AP spring of 2018. And so let's get started. All right, so this will be a little bit of review. We've talked about this, but it's important that we go over it again just to set up a base of where the U.S. was at the beginning of the war. And so as we learned, the U.S. is experiencing isolationism again after World War I. They don't want to get involved in European politics or anything. And they, along with other Latin American and Western Hemisphere countries, agree that it's best to stay out of the problems of Europe. Some of the reasons why is the loans to allied countries that go unpaid, Britain and France, and then both owed the United States millions of dollars, and the loss of American lives too. They don't really get involved in sending American boys overseas to die. And so we can understand kind of the attitude of America to be isolated. And so examples of this, the Congress refuses to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. In addition, the Congress refused to ratify or join the League of Nations. And so they essentially have drawn themselves in, and to ignore the events of Europe, right? Now, as we talked about in the 20s, economically, the U.S. did not isolate itself. It loaned money to Germany, reworked the war reparations, and then loaned money to France and Britain in order to get their economies going again, heavily invested in those European economies until, of course, the Great Depression. In the Great Depression, America doesn't have the money to invest in Europe anymore, so it pulls all that money out and isolates itself economically as well, right? One example or evidence that we have of this are the Neutrality Acts. And the Neutrality Acts are signed by the United States as well as a number of Western Hemisphere countries in Lima, Peru. And so there's a huge meeting in Lima where they sign and pledge that they would not get involved in world affairs anymore. We're done, right? We're going to take care of the Western Hemisphere and let the rest of the world take care of itself, right? Okay, so America's isolated. Now, in September 1939, the war in Europe begins, right? The Nazis invade Poland, and Europe goes to war. So the U.S. is stuck having to ask itself, what are we going to do? It seems to be happening all over again, and are we going to just have a redo of World War I? The U.S., of course, is going to stick to its neutrality and the Neutrality Acts that it signed in Lima, but it is going to express sympathy for the Allied cause. Now, you'll get more of this in U.S. history next year, but there was a strong feeling in the United States, especially in the mid-30s, that Hitler wasn't such a bad guy, and that sounds weird, I know, but what we have to remember is he hadn't really done anything yet that seemed crazy to some people. Now, today, Hitler's crazy from, like, the day he was born, but back then, of course, with the economies being the way they were, the Great Depression being as hard as it was on America as well as other European countries, and you look at Hitler, and Hitler, let's face it, fixed Germany. He made the trains run on time. He eliminated unemployment. He made Germans proud to be German again, at the expense of Jewish and people and minorities, of course, absolutely. But a lot of American businessmen were saying, leave him alone. He's fighting the commies. We give him a pass here. And so there was very little warning before in 39. A lot of Americans weren't really worried about Hitler. They were worried about communism, right? There was a strong Jewish voice in America who talked out against Hitler. But again, if we want to be honest with you, there's a lot of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americans as well as Europeans didn't really listen to Jews that much either. So that was the racism that existed in the 30s and 40s all over Europe and the United States, right? And so when the war begins, right, Hitler is shown to be kind of crazy and has visions of conquest and a conquest of Europe. And so American companies are given permission to supply France and Britain with weapons and supplies. Once France is out of the war, then it's all going to Britain, right? But the Congress is still very tentative about doing this because the Congress remembers all the unpaid loans from World War I. And so FDR kind of has to massage Congress to get this going. FDR, by the way, is very on board with helping the British and the French. Not going to war necessarily, but definitely helping them fight Hitler. And so he takes and is able to pass a bill in Congress that will be known as the Lend-Lease Act. And Lend-Lease essentially said this, and this is something that, again, you'll get more of in U.S. history, but just to give you the basis of it, if it is proven that this country is vital to the defense and safety of the United States, then it is okay for the United States to loan that country weapons or supplies in order to be, in an understanding that would be paid back later, right? So it's a loan. But you have to prove to the Congress and to the people of America that this country is vital to the security and vital to the safety of the United States. And when France falls and Britain is the only country facing Hitler, it is easy to see that Britain is the last bastion of democracy on Hitler's way across the Atlantic to the United States. And so Britain definitely fits that definition. And so America begins sending supplies and weapons and things into Britain. This makes Hitler furious. He begins to attack American ships on their way to England, right? Here we have a cartoon that says, truly encouraging how much of this stuff drifts into English ports, into British ports. And you've got this bridge that's going 2/3 of the way across the sea, and it's just being dumped into the ocean like, oh, we don't know, we're just going to put it here, and Britain's going to come grab it later, right? And so we are doing it, but we say we're not, right? It's kind of a tricky thing. Now, I don't know if this harkens you back to your childhood if you see this cartoon, but this cartoon was done by none other than Dr. Seuss, Theodore Heisel, right? Who would become Dr. Seuss. He did a lot of political war cartoons during World War II. And if you're interested in that, you should Google them and look at them. They're pretty fascinating. But this is the one that shows Lend-Lease. It's kind of, we're not doing it, but we are, kind of. So, but Hitler wasn't fooled, as we say. Outraged about the supply of U.S. goods flowing into Britain, Hitler begins U-boat warfare against U.S. ships in the Atlantic. Now, this is not like your old rinky-dink World War I U-boats. Hitler has spruced up the submarine fleet, lots of submarines fighting in groups, right? And they're called wolf packs, and they're going to be devastating to shipping across the Atlantic. Now, the last thing that happens before America gets officially involved in war, and America's focus was on Europe, right? There was no thought of Japan at this point. They were worried some, but we were really focused on Hitler. And so Churchill and FDR had met, and they had different conferences and meetings in the past. Churchill, of course, begging for more supplies, more weapons. FDR doing whatever he can, but he can't do much with the Congress. And so finally they meet in Newfoundland in 1941, and they come up with what's called the Atlantic Charter, which is an agreement between the countries to try to set things right in the world once the war is over. And so just to give a rundown of what they said, they promised to end Nazi tyranny. They promised to restore countries that were invaded by the Nazis. They promised to protect the 4 freedoms. And again, this is kind of a basis. Some historians say this is a basis for like the Declaration of Human Rights or a basis for the United Nations. But check out these freedoms. Freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from fear, typo, sorry, and freedom from want. Okay? And so those are your basic understandings, your basic rights that all humans have. And once the Nazi threat is done, that's what Britain and France will be fighting for. Now, FDR or other U.S. presidents are going to kind of throw this back at Churchill when we talk about freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from fear and want, because Churchill was an imperialist. And after the war, the U.S. is going to go, well, Churchill, what about these things, right? What about India? What about South Africa? What about all of your colonies? What about Hong Kong? And so it'll come back to bite kind of Britain when they agree to this. But anyway, so there's FDR and Churchill, Newfoundland, right? They are going to be 2 giants of World War II, 2 of the people that we'll talk about the most, 2 of the people that really shaped world history, right? Okay, so now let's go to Asia, to Japan, all right? The U.S., to sum up a large chunk of history here, the U.S. has become increasingly alarmed by Japanese expansion in Asia and was worried about their holdings in the Pacific. Now, we covered this in class, the idea of the Japanese annexation of Korea, and then their movement up into Manchuria, and then their invasion of China proper, right? They've been moving down, and we talked about the rape of Nanking. And so what I want to do is what the U.S. was doing this period of time is observing Japan doing this and becoming increasingly more worried about their holdings in the Philippines and Hawaii and places like that. Because as we talked about, the Japanese are fighting a 19th century imperial war. They're just trying to create a Japanese empire in Asia and the Pacific. And of course, they are going to push out anybody who's in their way. And one country that's in their way is the United States, right? So the Japanese eventually come up with a plan to attack the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. They get a commander to run this attack. His name is Admiral Yamamoto. Now, Yamamoto was distinctly qualified for this job because he had lived in America and very familiar with him. I think he might have spoken English, and he's very, very American aware, right? And so he warns the general staff, the genro that surrounds the emperor, right, that makes all the decisions. He says, this is a bad idea. He's the only one of them that says, we don't need to do this. And they're like, well, why not? They're in our way. We need to expand into the Pacific. And he says, but, you look at America, it's huge, it's massive. And yeah, they seem to be unaware at this point, kind of lazy and a little dumb. But you wake them up, and it's going to be trouble. The famous line that he says to the generals, he says, we will have 6 months of victory in the Pacific, and then we will have awakened the sleeping giant, right? And those words are going to go back to haunt the Japanese later on in the war. Okay, so then it happens, of course, December 7th, 1941. This is the Honolulu Star, the paper in Honolulu. We have the famous painting of one of the battleships going down. And so just major attack on the United States. And not to get into too much detail here, the advantages that the U.S. had from this, though, if there's silver linings, is that most of the aircraft carriers were out at sea, and that's going to be the future of naval warfare. And there was a fuel depot north of the fuel north of the Pearl Harbor that they didn't hit, with most of the fuel that would have run the aircraft carriers and the ships. And more importantly, there was a shipyard on Hawaii that they did not attack either. And the shipyard was where they rebuilt most of the ships and repaired most of the ships. And so those two things were important, and they were missed by the Japanese. But this is a famous attack here. December 8th, this is the infamy speech where FDR gives the speech in Congress, a day that will live in infamy. And, of course, Congress votes to join the war against Japan. It's one of those instances, right, just like we talked about in World War I, where the majority of American opinion was against war and against fighting, and it was like that. In December 6th, 1941, if you would have asked the average American, should we go to war, a large percentage of them would have said no, right? December 8th, everybody says yes. It was one of those events that changed the public opinion like that, right? Okay, so Axis and Allies, the sides are set at this point, right? The Allied powers are going to be Britain, Russia, and the United States. The Axis powers are going to be Germany, Japan, and Italy. Okay, so those are the two sides that are set in December of 1941. Okay, so let's talk about the Pacific first, and then we'll go to Europe. As Yamamoto predicted, the Japanese were successful in taking a number of islands from European powers as well as America in the first 6 months of the war after December 7th. Now remember, in Southeast Asia, much of the Japanese are fighting colonial areas that were conquered by the French, areas that were conquered by the British. And so, of course, the British and the French are engaged or defeated already. And so it's pretty easy for the Japanese to push those Europeans out of those countries and take over the Southeast Asian countries. But then they also push into the Pacific and take the Philippine Islands away from the United States, right? The commander of the Philippines, who would become commander of the American forces in the Pacific, is going to be known as General Douglas MacArthur, right? And he is ordered to flee the Philippines. As the Japanese attack the Philippines and begin taking island after island, MacArthur retreats with his soldiers eventually to a small island of Bataan, and the president orders MacArthur out. And so he jumps on a small boat and runs the Japanese blockade and takes off to Australia so he can plan the counterattack. This is going to be, whether it was the soldiers or whether it was MacArthur who emphasized this more, but this is something that he is going to regret, having to leave his soldiers. It doesn't look good. It doesn't look good for the commander to leave someone else in charge. And these are soldiers who are going to be captured by the Japanese and marched into those death camps in the Philippines, where many of them would die. And MacArthur always kind of felt, I believe, that he had abandoned them. But he was following orders, right? So he really didn't have a choice. And so he makes the big speech, I shall return, right, to the soldiers before he leaves. I don't know how effective that was. And the American soldiers captured and forced into death camps in the Philippines, right? All right. So, not going well for the United States in the Pacific. There's Douglas MacArthur. One of the things that is characteristic of him, something that always stands out, is this corncob pipe. He loved the corncob pipe. Interesting. But he was an interesting guy. He came from a military background. His father was military. His grandfather was military. He had lived in the Philippines as a boy, so he knew the Philippines very well. And he believed that he was protected by maybe God or some holy thing where he just wouldn't be shot. There's no bullet out there with his name on it. That's what he believed. And so he would go to the front. He'd walk around. There could be snipers in the trees, and he wasn't scared at all. People would be shooting, like bullets clanging off his Jeep, and he'd he didn't think he could die in battle. He believed that, right? And he did. All right, so the U.S. turned around in summer of 42. So here's where things began to tick up for the U.S. in the Pacific, right? Two major battles that are going to be good for the Americans and turn the tide of the war. First of all, we have the Battle of the Coral Sea, and this was the beginning of the invasion of Australia. The Japanese were going to defeat the U.S. Navy and then invade like New Guinea, Australia, and move their way down to New Zealand. And the U.S. Navy stopped them at the Coral Sea. Major, I think, if I remember correctly, is one of the last really big battleship battles. We have these two heavyweight battleships just slugging out at each other until one of them sinks, right? Like two heavyweight fighters in the ring just slugging each other, one of them falls. Yeah. So the Battle of the Coral Sea. Now Midway Island is a very interesting battle. It's one of these places where Midway Island is midway across the Pacific, right? It's not a clever name. It actually means something. And so the U.S. believed that the Japanese were going to attack something in the middle of the Pacific, maybe even Alaska. They were trying to figure out what it was. And so they began to send out messages from these different islands with coded in, and listen to Japanese messages to see what their code was. And I think with Midway, they sent out something about Midway that AF or something is the water tank is down or fresh water is out. And so the Japanese shoot back, and the text of AF water is out on AF. And so they knew AF was Midway, and then they learned the attack was coming toward Midway. So they were ready. They were waiting on the Japanese when the Japanese show up in Midway. And it's still a very close battle. And both sides lose tons of planes and tons of ships. But the Americans are able to win, right? Now, one of the things that's characteristic of Pacific fighting is something that we don't really know about or learn about so much, is how bloody it was. And we talked about the mindset of the Japanese soldier and how he would fight and die for the emperor, and so it was a disgrace for the Japanese soldier to surrender or give up. And so when the Marines would invade these islands, they would have to kill pretty much every Japanese soldier on the island before the island could be truly taken. And you would have Japanese hiding in jungles, hiding in caves, suicide bombers, things like that, and you always had to be careful. And so there was no let-up from the Japanese, regardless of how much territory they lost or how many times they'd been defeated. They would continue to fight. Very rarely did we ever take Japanese prisoners. And so that bloodbath is going to be very hard on American soldiers and Japanese soldiers in the Pacific because of the way it was fought. One of the strategies that was developed because it was so difficult to fight in these islands was the idea of island hopping, because the Japanese had a flawed strategy of occupying every single island and trying to keep every single island, even though some islands were just piles of rocks, right? And so the Americans would strategize and say, this island is important, this island is not. So they would hop over the island and only take the important islands and just isolate the island itself and just let the Japanese stay there without supplies until they surrendered or died, is what they would do. And the words, I think, from MacArthur was they would wither on the vine. So essentially what you're doing is you're cutting the island off, not letting any Japanese supplies in, and the soldiers there would just wither and die, right? So the U.S. began submarine operations against Japanese shipping. We talk about Hitler and the wolf packs in the Atlantic. Well, the U.S. did the same thing to Japanese shipping in the South Pacific. They had these wolf packs of U.S. submarines that would ship. Of course, Japan had to keep itself supplied, and they would supply themselves from China and Southeast Asia, trying to move those supplies into Japan in order to supply their army and with weapons and things. But U.S. submarine fleets greatly crippled the shipping, right, and caused lots of economic harm to Japan during this period of time. All right, so here we have the idea of island hopping, where the U.S. has a zone, right, and they've kind of zoned in. What they're going to do is they're going to take this island and skip the other islands in bloody fighting with Japanese soldiers. And what they're trying to do, they will take the Philippines back, and eventually they'll move up to Japan proper in an attempted invasion of Japan, right? So moving from island to island, skipping islands, and getting up there. But just really, really tough warfare all the way through the Pacific. All right, so the U.S. in total war. And this is one of the things we talked about in Midway and how Midway was so devastating for both sides, losing so many ships and so many planes. But the good news for the U.S. is that the U.S. could replenish those ships and planes, whereas the Japanese could not. So every aircraft carrier, every battleship, every plane that the Japanese lose, they cannot replace. And the Americans will replace 2 battleships for every 1 lost, right? And so war production in the U.S. reaches maximum levels. And we've talked about total war before, so I won't define it. We understand that from World War I that it's, everything is geared toward the war effort, economy, government, everything, right? So the women, of course, take the place of men in factories, and we have the symbol of Rosie the Riveter, who builds these machines and guns and things for war. And just to give an example of numbers here, right? World War II totals from 1940 to 45. Tanks and self-propelled guns, we made 88,000 tanks, 2,600,000 machine guns, 11,750,000 rifles. Fighter planes, we made 99,950 fighter planes, and in 4 years, America built 141 aircraft carriers. Crazy numbers, right? But again, the Japanese, America's the sleeping giant, and it is awake now, and the Japanese cannot keep up with this production. And that's going to be really the reason why the Japanese lose the war. Okay, so we have a couple of pictures here. Of course, the famous poster, Rosie the Riveter, kind of a symbol of American women. And check this, they're making bombers. And look at that hangar. Just bomber after bomber after bomber. I mean, come on. You're going to compete with that? We talked about that the only other country that reached levels of this production was Germany. And Germany's being bombed, and America's not being bombed. And so we're just shipping out these things, right? Left and right. All right, so the U.S. and Europe. So we got all the way where Japan is we'll get back to Japan in a second, but let's go to Europe, right? And so the idea of the U-boats, submarine wolf packs in the Pacific. America revives its old idea of the convoy system from World War I, where they're going to have merchant ships that travel with escorts to provide counterattack effectiveness of the U-boat, right, or the wolf packs. And again, a little more serious in World War I because the wolf packs were larger. But again, if you're a wolf pack, even a number of submarines, if you shoot into a convoy and one of those ships gets away and drops a depth charge near you, then every single submarine is going to get hit with that depth charge. And so being in a submarine is just dangerous, especially in World War II. A soldier, what's interesting, a general named Dwight D. Eisenhower becomes the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe. Interestingly, Eisenhower was actually second in command in the Pacific. He was kind of like the reporters. Well, MacArthur loved to make speeches, these big speeches. And reporters would sometimes say that, you'd hear MacArthur make this speech, but you got the real information from Eisenhower. He would come and tell you what you needed to know. And that was Eisenhower. Eisenhower was not a speech maker. He was not this flamboyant showman. He just wanted to get the job done, right? So he was perfect, a perfect choice for a Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. He moved his headquarters to London, so he was working with Churchill. He's working with de Gaulle and all the other Allied leaders in London. So that's where he's set up. Now, there's Eisenhower there, would become President of the United States later on as well. And so really kind of a down-to-earth, no-nonsense guy. Great choice. So, Allied strategy. There are 2 options here. Now, one option, of course, is the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. So what do? You go straight through Northern Europe. You drive all the way to Berlin, and you end the war. The war's over in 6 months to a year, right? Sounds easy. But remember, Hitler has taken over Northern Europe and has created Fortress Europe, which is a huge line of trenches, concrete bunkers, machine guns, cannons, all along the coast of northern France, right? And so it's not going to be as easy as it sounds. But this is the plan. It would take the pressure off the Russians, who the Russians have been invaded. We'll talk about the Russian front in class. And this is the one favored by American commanders. Most American commanders are like, let's just hit them. Let's just go in, hit them, and get this done, right? Option 2 was to go around Europe and go through Africa. Because at this point, the Nazis had gone through France and into northern Africa and began fighting Britain in North Africa as well. And the British were on the ropes. The only place they held in North Africa now was essentially Egypt. And they were about to lose Egypt. And so Churchill came up with this plan. And he called it, again, being poetic, the soft underbelly of Europe. So instead of trying to hit the hard, fortified Fortress Europe, go around through Africa, kick the Nazis out of Africa, and then move up through Sicily and Italy, and then into Germany from the south, right? That was the plan. So it would take the pressure off the British forces in Egypt, and this is the one Churchill liked. So Eisenhower weighed both these options and actually chose option 2, going against his commanders, and said, I think we'll go underneath through Africa and then up through Italy. And this is going to be called Operation Torch. Now, probably a good choice. You look at it on the map and you say, okay, a direct line to Berlin. But again, the question that Churchill asked is, are we ready? Are we ready to take on Fortress Europe at this point? What probably would have happened is, even if that attack in 1941 was repelled, another one would have come later, but it would have been very costly. But this way, we get the Nazis out of Africa and also out of Italy. The problem is, if you look at the terrain in northern Italy and in Switzerland, there's no way we're going to reach Germany through Italy. It's a sideshow. It's an effective sideshow, but there's no way that an invasion of Germany is going to come through Italy. It's just too mountainous, right? Okay, so here we are. We have 2 commanders here that are going to be in charge of Torch. On the British side, you have Montgomery, and he will attack from Egypt. On the American side, you have George S. Patton, one of the most flamboyant of the American commanders in American history. And he's going to attack from the west, and they're going to squeeze the Germans up and into Italy. Now, the Germans had a very effective field commander called Erwin Marshall, and Marshall's going to be Erwin Rommel. I'm sorry, I want to say Erwin Rommel. And Rommel's the Desert Fox, and he had been very effective up to this point. But when he goes against Montgomery and Patton, he is essentially outmatched, and he doesn't have the supplies. Hitler is focused on other places, and eventually he has to retreat, right? Okay, so here we are, Operation Torch. The Americans come through here, Casablanca in that area, the British over here in Egypt. They squeeze the Germans up and into Sicily and into Italy, right? Okay, so the Allies drive the Nazis out of Africa and Sicily into Italy. The Italians will surrender in September of 43, and they arrest Mussolini, right, and put him in a castle, fortified castle, as a prisoner. And so, look, okay, Italy's out of the war. That's pretty good. But like in World War I and the Austrians, Italy is kind of the little brother who can't do anything, and Hitler has to take care of them, right? They've never been successful in any of their attacks and any of their fighting, except for Ethiopia, and that was before World War II started. And so Hitler, again, comes to the rescue of Mussolini. And really, it's that Hitler does not want to lose. He doesn't want to lose Italy. And so what he does is he invades Italy with Nazis. He takes over the Italian peninsula. He rescues Mussolini and sets him back up in government. And even though the Italians have surrendered, now the Americans are fighting the Nazis in Italy. And that's why this is never really going to be successful in the Americans invading Germany from the south, right? So the Nazis rescue Mussolini, occupy Italy, and continue to fight. The Allied advance stalls in Italy, and they look to open up another front, right? Okay. Now, the D-Day invasion. So as the attack slows in Italy, then they go back to option 1, right? So now we can do this. And so it's called Operation Overlord. And it calls for an invasion of northern France and Belgium on a number of beaches, right? British and American troops on a number of beaches. And, of course, this is a very famous attack that you've probably heard of. And they're going to attack Fortress Europe. So on June 6, 1944, 500,000 Allies invade and break through northern France and break out into the French countryside. Now, this was the largest invasion since the invasion of Japan by the Mongols, right? This was, and it was larger than that one, and so that was the largest until the D-Day invasion, right? Okay, so it is successful. So then things begin to move pretty fast for the Allies. The Germans are being pushed by the Russians, again, which we'll talk about in class, and so they are being pushed by the Allies in the west, the Russians in the east, and they are suffering, right? They can't get in front of these two people, and so the Allies are able to push and push. August 1944, Paris was liberated. September of 1944, Brussels was liberated. And the Allies feel that the war could be over by Christmas of 44, right? Very optimistic, but hey, we're going to be home by 44. It's going to be great. I'll be home for Christmas, right? This song. That's what it meant. But it was not to be, because Hitler still had one card to play, and that was just throwing everything he could at the Allies to try to push them back into the ocean. So he got like all his troops together, all of the material and men that he had, and just one last push trying to get the Allies out. And that's going to be in December of 44, and it's going to be called the Battle of the Bulge, right? Now, because of weather, right, the Allied planes weren't allowed to fly over and bomb the Nazi positions. It was very snowy, very cold, and so the Germans were able to push the Allies back. and bulge the line, but not break the line, which is why it is called the Battle of the Bulge. And there are heroic stories of the 52nd Airborne who goes in at Bastogne and is surrounded by Nazis but continues to fight until they're relieved, and all these great stories of American valor and courage. Patton driving through the night to relieve the 42nd Airborne at Bastogne, right? And so eventually the air clears, and that's all that really needed to happen was the weather clear so the Allied bombers and planes could come out and push the Nazis back. And they do. And so this is Hitler's last attempt. It fails, and so now it's only a matter of time before Germany is invaded and Hitler is defeated, right? So here we have the Battle of the Bulge. And the dotted lines represent where the front was, and the solid line represents where the front ended up. So they were pushed back quite a bit into Belgium, but they were able to hold and not break, and eventually pushed back this way. Right? It was around Christmas. It was December 25th, 1944. So at Christmas, these guys are stuck in the snow, surrounded by Nazis. Merry Christmas. Okay, so the end of the war in Europe, the U.S. soldiers pushed toward Germany. The Russians pushed through Poland, invasion from the east. Allied planes are bombing this whole time, British and American planes. They dropped 300 tons of bombs on Germany during like 1944-45, right? Again, we talked about the Battle of Britain. Maybe we can bomb them into submission. Maybe we can bomb them until they give up. It never works. Production in Germany in 1945 actually went up as they were being bombed, right? So by the end, the Berlin is surrounded by the Russians. It's funny because Eisenhower allowed the Russians to go in first, and we'll talk about the Russian front in class. And it's pretty obvious as to why the Russians would be able to go in and take Hitler because they had suffered the most. But it also led to a lot of questions by American commanders as to what really happened to Hitler and what the end of the Third Reich was like. So the Russians go in. Hitler kills himself in his underground bunker, which is a good story. Again, one of the movies on the movie list is Downfall. Watch it. It's really good. It's German subtitles, but really the best portrayal of Hitler I've ever seen. And then May 8th, 1945, the war officially ends, and that's called VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day. Okay, VE Day. All right. Okay, so here's what we have as far as a map to put it all on the screen. Of course, the British and the U.S. come through France on D-Day and push into Germany this way. The Russians, over a period of 41, 42, 43, they're moving through Poland and eventually make it into Russia, or make it into Germany, and surround Berlin and eventually conquer Berlin. Hitler's staff tries to burn his body, but they find the remains of his half-burned body, and they keep it. Of course, Stalin doesn't tell us what happened to him, so there's all this mysterious stuff until communism ends and we find out what really happened to Hitler. Okay, there's a photo of this is the Reichstag, the government building, and look how bombed out it is. And these are Russian troops. And I was kind of Photoshop, but those are Russian planes and a tank there. But I just want you to see the Reichstag and how bombed it was. Is really what I want you to see. Because a lot of that looks Photoshopped. Communist propaganda. All right, now. So the defeat of Japan. So now we have to shift to Asia, okay? And now we have to defeat Japan. And we have pushed the Japanese back and back until eventually we're bombing them every night. And we are close to an invasion of Japan proper, right? So the U.S. planes began bombing Japanese targets and destroying Japanese cities. And this is not the atomic bomb. These are just bombers flying over and dropping tons and tons of bombs. I mean, we firebomb Tokyo and kill like 78,000 people. I mean, we're devastating Japan. But the Japanese do not surrender. And we talked about how bombing doesn't cause people to surrender. But there is the idea of the emperor, right? And how they refuse to abandon the emperor. They refuse to give up because the emperor is worshipful, right? We'll say that. So the closer the U.S. gets to the main Japanese island, the harder the fighting gets. One terribly hard battle that was fought is at Okinawa, okay? And that's the last island taken by the American generals. And so they begin planning the invasion of Japan proper. And because of all of the lives that they've lost and all the islands in the Pacific, American generals were estimating that they could lose 1 million or more men in an invasion of Japan, right? Because as the Japanese government was saying, that they were going to fight to the last man, woman, and child. And there were films coming out of Japan that showed women with sharpened bamboo sticks and children with like knives or whatever, training to fight the Americans as the Americans invaded. And we don't know that for sure, but that's what the Japanese government wanted us to believe, right? So, U.S. generals were worried an invasion of Japan would cause millions of casualties, and the Japanese government claims that it will fight to the end, as we talked about, right? But then we have the idea of the Manhattan Project, Okay, the Manhattan Project is the secret code word for the research into atomic weapons or an atomic bomb that could be used in World War II. Led by Erich Oppenheimer, who was a German-born Jew who had fled the Nazis into America and then, ironically, works on this project to help America win the war. So that he and other scientists in different places around the country, and eventually focused in Los Alamos, they're going to New Mexico. They're going to work on this weapon, right? Okay, so the Manhattan Project, created on rumors that the Nazis were also working on an atomic bomb, right? And so Hitler had researched weapons. He was researching new weapons all the way through the war. The first one to fire a guided missile were the Nazis, and that was toward England. And so there was a suspicion that he had been working on an atomic bomb. And what a horrible thing that would have been if he would have gotten a hold of that. But it turned out once we defeated Hitler that we realized that he hadn't really made any progress in splitting the atom and creating an atomic bomb. But the Americans continued to develop the atomic bomb since they had already started. And finally, in 1945, we have the first successful test of the bomb in the deserts in southwest New Mexico, right? The story is that some of the scientists there were taking bets on how powerful the bomb would be, because what you're doing with splitting the atoms, you're creating a chain reaction. And at the time, they really didn't know when the chain reaction would end. And some scientists actually had taken a bet that it would destroy the entire state of New Mexico. We didn't know, right? So they hit this bomb attached to a tower, and they drop it, and it explodes, and it's successful, right? It doesn't destroy New Mexico, but it destroys a lot of stuff. So finally, Roosevelt has died by this point. He died before Hitler shot himself, maybe a few weeks before he shot himself. Dies in office of complication with polio and many other things. He had served 4 terms as president. He was really old. He had just run himself down. And so he died in Georgia, right, at Warm Springs, and was replaced by his vice president, Harry Truman, which ironically, it was the first time Truman had been his vice president. And so now Truman accepts the responsibility of being the leader of the U.S. forces at the end of World War II, and also makes the decision to drop the atomic bomb on Japan. Okay, so he authorizes the bomb to be dropped. The first bomb is known as Fat Man because it's big and fat, and it's dropped on the city of Hiroshima in Japan, and it essentially does major damage. 60% of the city is pulverized, 60,000 killed, 100,000 wounded, 200,000 homeless. Now, the U.S. had given a warning to Japan that we are going to unleash a weapon that you've never seen before, the destructiveness of this, unless you surrender. And the Japanese, of course, ignored it. They didn't want, and again, they're still with the mindset of we will never surrender, we love the emperor, and that kind of stuff. And so the bomb hits, and the Japanese government doesn't surrender. It's very quiet, right? They don't say anything. And there's actually, behind the scenes, politicians in the government who are trying to get Russia to come in and negotiate a peace with the United States, but the military generals will not hear of it, right? And so 3 days later, America drops the second bomb. It had 2, and it dropped the second one, and that one's called Little Boy, a smaller bomb on the city of Nagasaki, killing 78,000 people. And so after the second bomb is dropped, then Japan surrenders. And September 2nd, 1945. So September 2nd, 1945 is known as VJ Day, or Victory in Japan. Okay. All right, so here we have a photo of Fat Boy. Big, right? So that's why it was called Fat Man, right? And then we have the photo from, there are a couple of bombers there that dropped. One dropped the bomb, and one's flying alongside to get a photo of it. And that's the photo of the actual atomic blast, the first atomic blast used in war. In world history, right? And so you see the city down here, and then the blast coming up into the air. And this is the surrender on the ship, VJ Day. What we have is MacArthur here in the corner, and then the Japanese delegation. Many of the generals committed ritual suicide rather than surrender to the American forces. These are the ones that are left, right? They come on the ship to sign the treaty. This guy here, if he looks really thin to you and gaunt, he is. He was the commander of the forces in the Philippines after MacArthur left. And he was put in a prison camp and almost starved to death. And so MacArthur wanted him on the deck of that ship when the Japanese surrendered, and put him there. Now, with the Japanese, there was only one commander that was ever executed by the Americans, and that commander was the commander of the death camp in the Philippines. And they executed him. All the rest of them either committed suicide themselves or were sent to prison for a few years and let out. The emperor was not jailed at all. He was considered by the United States to be a puppet, and so they kind of let him off the hook because he didn't really make any decisions. He would later visit the United States, right? And they let him keep his palace and everything like that. And MacArthur really would be the one to help rewrite the Japanese Constitution based on the American model, with an emperor being kind of a constitutional monarch, right? Okay, so that's it. And so the U.S. in and out of the war. It was a brief run, but I wanted you to get that. And as we'll meet next time, we'll talk about Russia, and then there will be another lecture on the Cold War. And pretty much throughout, we'll do lectures on independence movements in different countries, and catch everyone up on flipped classroom style and review in class before this exam coming up, right? So anyway, have a great weekend. I'll see you Monday.